Hey everybody, and welcome to this Adobe Max 2020 session. My name is Michael, and in this video, I'm excited to talk about the tool that I've built my entire career around, the one and only Photoshop. I'm going to show you how I do my work, and I'm going to try to break down aspects of my work into actionable tips and techniques that you can reproduce in Photoshop. I have been speaking at Adobe Max for 6 years now, giving talks on visual design and workshops on icon design. And that pilgrimage to California to meet all of you and experience the wonder that is Adobe Max has been a returning adventure for this Danish designer that I've been looking forward to each year. So it does feel a bit empty to have this digital abyss between us. But this is 2020 and we're going to make the best of it. I'm calling this session Photoshop for Visual Designers because Photoshop is used by many different people for many different things. So when you talk about Photoshop, you run the risk of missing your target audience simply because how I use the tool might be very different from how others use it. And when I talk about visual design, I'm primarily thinking about designs for screens in the shape of interfaces, branding, and iconography. I've worked as a visual designer for 15 years, and the sort of work I like to produce is this vibrant, dimensional, and playful expression. App icons particularly have been a big passion of mine, and I'll use examples of that to illustrate the techniques I've developed over the years to produce this sort of work. And even if you're not specifically producing this sort of work, my hope is that somewhere in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you at least one thing or way of using Photoshop that you didn't already know or had thought of. Let me preface this whole thing by saying that Photoshop is an excellent tool for visual design. In an age where there's a lot of other vector-based UI tools out there, Photoshop holds the magic power of raster-based graphics to produce effects that are tough to create in some of the other apps. Sure, something like XD is great if you need a lot of artboards, but as soon as you want to widen the spectrum of visual design, Photoshop is going to be your friend. Start with something simple, like how to bend light and simulate 3D just using layer styles. Dimensionality is happily creeping its way back into our interfaces, and so making something that feels like it has depth and volume is a cornerstone of both UI and icon design. But 3D apps can be big and complicated. Luckily, Photoshop really has all the cheat codes to make something appear dimensional. So let's just start out with a new document in Photoshop and try to see if we can recreate that dimensionality just using a shape and layer styles. Now, the cool thing about this being recorded is that you can pause me at any time and rewind if I go over things a little too fast, rushing to meet that 25-minute deadline that they've given me. Let's start by finding our ellipse tool. Over here, come down, choose your ellipse tool. And here's the first quick tip coming at you. I'm going to try to spice this whole thing up with little quick tips, right? Holding down Shift will keep things neat and clean. Instead of not holding down Shift, you'll get like weird ovals. Holding down Shift will make sure that you have a perfect circle, right? Anyways, the Shift key is going to be your friend. Circle. Now we've got a beautiful big round circle. It's just sort of a black disc on a white background, right? How could we even proceed to make this dimensional? Well, layer styles is the cheat code you've been waiting for. And so, first of all, I'm going to try to change the color of this thing into something a little easier to manipulate. So we're going to choose like a grayish tone. Go to your layers pane, right click and go to blending options. And in here, you'll find all the different layer styles. If you've used Photoshop for visual design before, you're probably familiar with these layer styles. And I'm going to use them to fake 3D, basically. I'm going to go down, I'm going to find inner glow. Well, let's start there, right? And instead of just having it be an inner glow, I'm actually going to use it to create an inner shadow. Just sort of finding like a subtly darker gray like that, right? And then I'm going to use inner shadow to see if I can get a little bit of depth in there. But let's make sure that the shadow's coming from underneath. And let's make it a big, soft shadow. Let's try something like 180. The distance is maybe like 50, or maybe it's even more. Maybe it's like 100. So using inner shadow and inner glow, it sort of created this illusion of roundness, really. But we can improve this. And I love to use gradients. So let's add a gradient to this. Let's make it so it's a white to opaque gradient right here. Make sure that it's radial right here. And then I'm going to show you something. This blew my mind the first time I saw this. You can actually pull around the radial gradient. See? which is super cool. And it really starts to look a little bit 3D, right? Like you're pulling around the light source on this orb that we're making, right? And essentially you can try to tweak these values to make it appear more 3D. A big part of making something that feels physical on the screen obviously has to do with lighting. And what does lighting do? Well, it casts shadows. And there's more ways of doing shadows in Photoshop that there's attendees at Adobe Max, but here's one I'm fond of. Let's duplicate our ellipse layer. And here's quick tip number 2. Instead of right-clicking and hitting duplicate, you can actually duplicate anything in the layers pane simply by holding down Option on a Mac and dragging out the layer. Boom, now we have 2. That's another little quick tip for you. Anyways, with this secondary layer, I'm going to disable all the effects and I'm going to change the color into completely black. I'm going to go to filters and then I'm going to convert for smart filter. Then I'm going to go down into blur and choose Gaussian blur. Choose a big soft radius for this, something like 50 maybe, and I can sort of drag that around. So what I usually do is I simply just transform this shadow element that we have now, hitting Command T, and then again holding down Shift to keep those dimensions proper. We're gonna get like something like that. We might scale it down just a bit, place it right underneath it. And then I'm going to use a bit of low opacity here, maybe something like 40 or 50. And I'm changing this, by the way, just by using the numbers keys. You can see here it's got 1, got 0, that's 100%, right? So maybe something like 50. I actually want to make another Gaussian blur layer, an immediate shadow right underneath the ball. And this one, this shadow is going to be more intense and smaller. Maybe for this smaller, more immediate shadow, we'll drop down the radius of the Gaussian blur to maybe something like 30, right? Move it up a little bit. I'm going to go down. I'm going to create a gradient layer down here for my background. I'm going to choose, let's just go with a black to white. Another cheat code is just to drop the opacity of this. With literally just 4 layers, we've created a scene that kind of feels like it has some depth, some 3D. As soon as I turn off these effects, the illusion is lost, right? And I think that's so powerful that with just an inner shadow, an inner glow, and a gradient overlay, we have this 3D object. And you can use this in interfaces, in illustrations, in icon design. Quick tip. Do you know the feeling of copying something from one Photoshop document to another Photoshop document, and you're literally just sort of taking all the stuff that you need from one document and you're pulling it over into that other document, and it's all crazy placement time, right? Well, here's a fix for you. If you do that same thing, you take the layers that you need out here and you hold down your good old friend, the Shift key, and you pull them over into the other document, boom. Photoshop is going to attempt to place those things in the exact same pixel coordinates as the original document. Wow! This also works between artboards when you're doing big UI stuff and you want to move one button from one artboard to another artboard, holding down Shift, duplicating over to that artboard, and it's going to be in the exact same space. So for my next trick, let's look at materials. Making something that's essentially just a bunch of flat shaped layers in Photoshop look like real life materials is a life-changing technique that you'll continue to refine for the rest of your career. And like a good cooking program, I've already gone ahead and done a few example materials. Let me just deconstruct these for you real quick. Out here on the left side, we've got the ball that we just made. I've tweaked it a little bit, but it's essentially still the same thing. Same flat basic circle. With a small shadow and a big shadow. Moving on up, making something like plastic was a big hit in 2010. And it's coming back. So it's the same base shape. Let's study the layer styles. I'm using an inner shadow and I'm using an inner glow. The point is that I wanted the surrounding lighting to sort of bleed into this material. I'm using inner glow to do that, right? The other thing that's different about this layer style here for plastic is I'm using bevel and emboss. Bevel and emboss is the boss. I love it. It's fantastic. It allows you to create these subtle little streaks of lighting or shadow within shapes. And in this case, I'm using it to create a very subtle highlight at the bottom edge of the circle right here. You can see if I disable it, that's what that looks like, right? So it's using both some soft light and some screen to create a little more top light and then that little inner glow of lighting right there. With 25 minutes in this session, I don't have time to go through each and every one of these settings, but take a screenshot, see if you can reproduce it, and then play around with it. This next layer is an old friend of mine. He's back. It's gloss. Now, gloss is amazing. Gloss is just sort of trying to mimic the lighting hitting a very reflective surface, right? And the way that you do that is it's the simplest thing in the world. Let me just recreate that for you real quick here. Let me turn it off, and let's again copy just the main base shape here by holding down Option. And then I'm going to make it a slightly smaller. I love using percentages up here instead of doing it manually. That's just something beautiful about numbers, right? Now we've got sort of an inner white shape. And really, one of the cool ways of doing gloss on a completely round object is just taking one of these nodes here, just selecting the node and pulling it upwards, kind of like that. I love that, right? What you can also do, you can keep these side nodes if you'd like. I'm just going to use the pen tool and then sort of erase those. And then we're going to not have any fill in there at all. So I'm going up here and changing the fill right here. So there's no fill. We're just going to fill it with our own layer styles. It's not going to have a color by itself. And then I'm going to go and use a gradient overlay, a very simple, completely white to transparent gradient. I'll reverse it here. Look at that thing. Now it's starting to look like something, right? If you want to spice it up a little bit, you can actually add like a tiny little inner shadow and use that as a tiny little highlight, which I usually do to just cast that little edge light there, right? Again, you can move the gradient to make it a little less harsh. There you go. There's some gloss. Another little quick tip coming for you. Do you know the feeling of looking through your messy layers pane with lots of little open folders and unnamed layers? You're looking for that one layer, you can't find it, and then you're leaving everything a mess. Well, to collapse and fold up the whole layer structure, all you need to do is hold down Option while clicking that little disclose button, clicking it, and then opening it up again, and you see that all your folders are neatly closed again. And the same thing actually works in reverse. If you hold down Option and click it again, when you open it, you're going to see all of your folders open again. And this is a great way of keeping your layers pane slightly less messy when you're working in a document. Our next contender is aluminum or aluminium, depending on where you come from in the world. Again, just a basic shape layer. Let's go in and investigate the blending options for this thing. And again, I'm using Bevel and Emboss to create that little very subtle light there at the bottom and a little more lighting at the top. Then we're using Inner Shadow, same as before. I'm using Inner Glow again to create more of a rim light around the whole shape. And then again, just a tiny gradient overlay right there, the middle of it. Now there's a couple of other components to this. First of all, I'm using one of my favorite tricks is just to use some noise to create a little bit of tactility, a little bit of texture. And the way that you create noise is the simplest thing in the world. I'm just going to go and find the rectangle tool. And I'm just going to drag out a rectangle. Then we're going to go to Filter and then Convert to Smart Objects. You're going to go down, you're going to find Noise up here, and then you're going to add noise. And you're just going to crank that up all the way. You can use a uniform or a Gaussian noise if you like. And then I use a monochromatic noise for these things because I don't really want the color in there. I'm just going to hit OK. And now we have a noise layer. And that's essentially what I've done here. I've just taken the noise layer and I've dropped the opacity down to 10%. You can move up the opacity and you can see the noise layer sort of coming forward, and it's going to be a little too crazy, right? So it's a very subtle little move, but it's something that I use in my work all the time to create that side sense of material. Another little trick that's going on here is that with this material, I wanted to mimic light sort of hitting the surface and bleeding into the surrounding. And to do that, I've got a layer up here called Glow. Now, Glow is literally just a circle that I have converted for smart filters and then added a Gaussian blur to it. So that you get like this big, soft glow that you can move around. Okay, let's move on to something a little more tricky. Here's Chrome, a material so prized in old school UI and synthwave album covers alike. Chrome is excellent. And it is also kind of tricky to reproduce. But believe it or not, let's just inspect the layers out here. It is literally just a base layer with a bunch of effects on it and two separate shape layers for the reflections. First of all, let's just do the little toggle on toggle of the effects just to see, Yep, that is indeed just layer styling producing that effect. Again, good old bevel and emboss, and it's pretty strong in this case. You can really notice how I'm using it to create a strong refraction of light. I've got multiple layers of inner shadow. One of them is actually casting a shadow to make it appear more ball-like, rounder. Then we're using a set of gradient overlays. Now let's break these down. First of all, at the top here, we've got a radial gradient overlay, which is casting sort of just a shadow in the middle of this, just to break up the reflection a little bit, right? I wanted that white surface that the ball is resting on to be represented. This last gradient overlay is where the real magic happens. That is this curvature line here across the edge of the ball. What sells this is that this is probably what a chrome ball would look like if you were in a studio and you took a picture of it, because you'd be able to see like the white surface or paper that it was resting on. And so that sharp gradient there, if we're going in and investigate the gradient, this is how you do metallic gradients. You change from something that's really dark to really light really quickly, like here, for example, right? And so that's going to create sort of this illusion of reflection. And so I added a folder up here, which is basically just two shape layers with a bit of outer glow just to soften them up a bit here. Let's move on to this next ball over here, which is water, or really any colored reflective surface that has some translucency in it. So let's break it down. Let's look at the layer styles. Again, you'll notice that there's an inner shadow. And with a material like water, you really want a lot of fringe lighting, a lot of rim light. And so this is made with the blending mode overlay, sort of burns into the color underneath it. Again, using outer glow for that fringe lighting. And I'm coloring the outer glow here. It's a very soft teal. Check out how it's impacting the shadow down here. I think there's a really cool way of mimicking this sort of light coming off the material. I'm just adding a color overlay to that. By colorizing the shadows, you're essentially telling the viewer that when light has gone through this object, it has changed colors. To produce the lights in a material like this, I've actually just used a good old friend gloss. It's just a shape layer here. But to make it appear softer, what I've done is a bit of a hack. Let me just delete this layer mask. Now you see that it's like all sharp and weird looking, right? But if you create a mask for this layer, here's another quick tip for you. Holding down Control-Alt, while you have brush selected, you can actually change the diameter of the brush by simply holding down those two keys and dragging, while clicking your mouse button, to change the diameter of your brush, which is really cool. And you can also move your mouse up and down to change the hardness of the brush. Painting inside this mask will create a really interesting effect. Look what's happening here. Whoa. The last material I wanted to show you is this iridescent material over here. And it's made in much the same way as the water, with one big exception, and that is it has zero fill, which essentially means that it's see-through, kind of like a soap bubble, right? Look what happens when I sort of move it in front of one of the other orbs here. The layer style is very similar to the water one. I'm using an inner shadow with overlay, using an inner glow here to create a very strong rim light. Gradient with a little bit of lighting, and again a little bit of outer glow. So that's it for the iridescence. As you can tell, figuring out how to render a material is all about studying it in real life and applying lighting to mimic it. And you want to do that in a way that is as elegant and as clean as you possibly can without messing up your layers pane. If you want to get even more advanced and realistic, you want to step up and use textures in your work. Masking textures onto shapes could be its own 30-minute session. Here I was trying to render an image of Kylo Ren, and I wanted to render that thick cloth fabric hood that he has. Hard to do without using real-world textures. And so I found some heavy fabric cloth, and then I'm masking that onto a shape layer. I'm doing a lot of little tricks to it here. I'm colorizing on top of the textures. I'm warping the texture by hitting Command T and then hitting warp right here. So I'm sort of trying to get the texture to mimic the shape underneath. But to the extent of what we can cover in a session like this, all you need to know is that you can use textures to mask onto those same shape layers that we just played around with to create results that look more realistic. So that's dimensionality, lighting, shadows, materials. I use this stuff in my work all the time. It's what I use to produce this translucent colored glass in this Photos app icon and the iridescent material on the bird in this icon. or really any of these latest works that I've been doing. There's a lot more to iconography, of course, than just choosing the right materials and rendering these things in Photoshop, but I think it's such a vital skill as a visual designer to be able to understand the material science, if you will, behind these things. I'm going to make sure that I'll leave a link to this PSD file somewhere so that you can play around with these values. But as I think you can tell from this, it's really all about experimentation. There really is no one right way of doing this. Okay, I wanted to show you a new feature in Photoshop that's really useful for UI designers. I've got a game UI that I'm working on here for our upcoming Switch title. But for this new cool Photoshop feature, this could be any UI. It could be a web UI, it could be for an app. It's useful for all of us. It's called Live Shapes. You know how when you're working on an interface and you're laying out all these wonderful shapes on containers? Well, Live Shapes is a massive help in doing that. Here, for example, I've got a container with some information in it, and like any other UI designer, I might be tweaking this container, moving things around, changing padding, changing rounding of corners. But first, a quick tip. Did you know that in Photoshop, there's actually a shortcut to select whatever layer is right in the path of your cursor? I use this all the time, particularly when you have big, complicated layer structures with hundreds of different layers, right? And you just want to choose that one single layer, like this container, for example, here. But you have to go down and drill in and try to figure out where that layer is. And well, if you hold down Option, you'll notice that your cursor changes into this dual arrow. Hi, friend. Holding down that Option key and right-clicking will take you right to that layer. You can do that with any layer. It's just going to choose the first layer in the path of the cursor. So I can select, the text layer right here, and look, it's right there. So choosing this rounded rectangle, and with the magic of the new Photoshop, I can now go into Properties up here and scroll down, and here I have all of my live shape properties available, which means I don't have to redraw this rectangle. If I want to change any of these values, if I want to try out a more rounded, cornered version of this, boom, I just change the values and it's right there. But live shapes is so much more. It's this non-destructive editing of shapes. Let's imagine that I wanted to resize this container. All I need to do is just hit Command T to resize the container, and I'm just pulling it out. Maybe I want to make room for some more data here. I'm just going to hit Enter. Notice how it did not stretch out these sort of corners in a weird way. I still have access to all of my data up here. I can go and be like, maybe I want the rounding to be a little sharper. And there it is. All that data is still live there. And that's the magic of live shapes. And I use that all the time, but I want to make sure that all my buttons and containers continue to be editable. Now I want to shift gears for a bit and show you some clever ways of working within Photoshop that's saving me a lot of time. For this next example, I'm going to use this little cutie here that I got to work on for the app Yarn Buddy. The cool thing is that this is actually a smart object. So when I save this out, it's going to update the smart object inside a big template file that I have. And you'll see that all of these sizes here have updated. So smart objects can be used for a lot of things, but in this case, it's a great way of nesting things within files. Things that need to change in a lot of different places. So if you have button styles that need to change across an interface, or if you have icons like these that need to scale to many different sizes, using smart objects is a fantastic way of doing that. And if you're doing icon work like this, you can get a freebie version of this template from applypixels.com. Now, the very linchpin of my use of Photoshop is this mastery of both vector and raster graphics and the relationship between the two. As you know, vector is a graphics that is defined in terms of points connected by lines and curves to form shapes. It means that when we have a vector shape, we can scale it infinitely without any loss or degradation of that shape. Raster graphics, on the other hand, is pixel-based or a bitmap. It's a dataset displayed in a rectangular grid. It contains that information, but no more, meaning that when you scale up raster graphics, you'll see degradation of quality, also sometimes referred to as pixelation. Now, the cool thing about Photoshop is that it does both vector and raster. Each of them have their own power. Vectors are scalable shapes, whereas raster is much more easier to manipulate on the pixel level to create and combine effects that change the appearance. You'll need to understand when to use vector shapes and when to rely on raster data to achieve the look you're going for. Generally, I go to great lengths to keep my work as vector shapes for as long as possible, because that ensures me that it stays easily editable and scalable. In the 3D orb example from before, the circle shape itself is vector. If I'm to use the brush, for example, like this, that would be raster. If I scale up this image, the circle remains crisp, whereas the brush is upscaled with the raster data it has. To further complicate things, all of the layer styles we added to the circle to make it appear 3D is technically raster. To get that look and that easy to edit style, Photoshop has filled the vector shape with raster data. Now that's raster generated on the fly within Photoshop, meaning that it's actually infinitely scalable within Photoshop. If you scale up the image, Photoshop will attempt to scale up these styles too. It's still raster, but there's just more of it. It's an important distinction to understand because while Photoshop can export SVGs and other vector formats, most of this type of work will eventually include some raster. So when we use vector shapes or the pen tool to create the foundations of our graphics, it's not so much because the final output is going to be infinitely scalable or strict SVG, it's more because we want our work files to have some level of non-destructive scalability within the application. Let me show you a quick trick though that I use all the time to essentially convert a raster-based shape into a workable vector-based one. This is a raster-based reference image I used to create my shape-based chrome ball that we looked at earlier. Now here's a glorious trick that I learned to take something from a raster image and convert it into a vector shape. In this example, we'd love to get those softbox reflections as vector shapes. And the way that we can do that is we go up and find our selection tool and just go with good old magic wand. And then we just click what we want to select. What we can then do is we can right click and then go down and choose Make Work Path. A tolerance of 2 pixels is usually fine. Click OK. It's hiding in here in the Paths panel right here as a work path. But what we want is for it to be a shape layer. And to do that, we're going to go into Layer, and then we're going to find New Fill Layer, and then Solid Color. Hit OK, and boom, there we go. We now have a vector-based version of that shape. It's not always perfect, but we now have nodes that we can adjust and tweak to our heart's desire. I've been tracing things with the pen tool like a doofus for years, trying to get just the right shape, when really all I needed to do, in most cases, is just to use the selection tool, create a work path, and then convert that work path into a solid fill layer right there. Now, I don't know another application with such a versatile set of use cases as Photoshop. So many ways to achieve a result, which is why it's also so exciting to see how other people use this application and what tips and tricks they've developed over the years. I expect I'll continue to learn how to use this application for many years to come. And the things that I've shown you today are just, a short excerpt of what I use to produce my work right now. But that's all we had time for in today's session. 25 minutes really isn't a long time to do anything. But I hope you got a little glimpse into how I produce my work and that you got something out of this. And maybe, just maybe, I taught you a little technique or tip or way of thinking about Photoshop that you hadn't thought of before. And that would make me incredibly happy. If you want to learn more about me or my work, you can find it on flarup.co. That's just my last name, Flarup. I'm also Flarup on all the socials. So on Twitter, Instagram, on YouTube. And if you like this, maybe Adobe will bring me back to give a live performance in a future timeline with just a little bit more normalcy. Until then, stay safe, take care, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for watching.